everybody. This is Kip Murdoch, and we're in Bamway, California for the 10th annual Bamway Ladies Marathon. 61 gentlemen are here to cheer as their wives compete in this event. Danny Prince is along beside me for expert commentary. And Danny, as the husband of a three-time Bamway winner, you know better than just about anybody that each of these gentlemen is more than just his better half's cheerleader. He is also her coach.
And not just a coach, Kip, a competitor.
A competitor, you say?
A co-competitor. Our wives may be prancing alone out there on their dainty feminine toes, but in our hearts, we husbands are out there dashing along right with them.
That's very eloquently put, Danny.
Well, thank you, Kip.
So you're saying that husbands come here as partners to their wives rather than just coaches and cheerleaders.
That's right. Partnership between a man and his little woman is what Bamway is all about. And Kipper, that's the reason the Bamway Athletic Commission makes it a point to reward the men for their efforts in this competition.
You know, that's so true. The fair lady who succeeds in crossing the finish line ahead of her 59 determined yet delicate opponents will receive a lovely bouquet of long-stemmed roses.
Lovely couldn't begin to describe it, Kip.
And for playing the triple role of coach, cheerleader, and confidant, the winner's husband will receive $20,000 in cash, plus a gold plaque on which both his and his wife's names will be engraved. Now, Danny, you have 3 of these plaques hanging in your den.
That I do. And when I ran out of space to hang them, I told the missus we had to either quit competing or quit winning.
Oh, that's when you retired. But there was another reason you put Maureen out to pasture. Tell our listeners about that.
Well, I'm proud as punch to tell the listeners that the little woman and I had ourselves a baby boy. Today, Danny Jr. is 2 years old.
Congratulations, Danny.
Thanks, Kip.
For those of you who just tuned in, I'm Kip Murdoch with Danny Prince, and we're in Bamway, California for the 10th running of the Bamway Ladies Marathon. Now, Danny, this course is not marathon distance.
That's right, Kip. As most of you already know, women can't run anywhere near as far as men can. So while a men's marathon will cover a tad over 26 miles, the Bamway Marathon course covers approximately a quarter mile, or once around the block to you and me.
And what accounts for the ladies' inability to run a men's marathon distance?
I'd say it's the size difference. We men tend to average 6 feet 4 inches in height, compared to only 5 foot 1 inch for our friends of the fair sex. With shorter drumsticks than their male counterparts, it takes the girls much more leg movement to travel a comparable distance.
Well, how about the weight difference, Danny? Men average 195 to 205 pounds to a woman's 95 to 105.
Yes, that's a 100-pound weight difference. The less ample mass of these matrons will not sustain them over a 26-mile course. So the planners of Bamway made some allowances when they designed this course.
We can also take into account the fact that these women are running in evening gowns and high-heeled shoes.
Yes, Kip, but most of these ladies design their own gowns to reduce the toll that running a marathon takes on the female figure. And what's more important is the mental aspect of running. The girls just don't have the natural competitive drive that a man has. That's where we husbands come in. Our wives may get their great gams from nature, but they get their competitive edge from us. The wives may run the race, but it's the husbands who make them winners by training them month after agonizing month.
And since you mentioned it, let's talk about preparation required for competing in the Bamway Ladies Marathon. How much time does it take?
It varies from couple to couple. With Maureen and me, well, we used to allow 6 to 8 months to get ready. And then the last time we competed, I figured I'd refine the training schedule to a point where we needed only 3 months to get ready.
What about the husbands? How do they get ready?
The husband's hardest task is keeping his wife's morale up. The little woman has a tendency to get discouraged when she sees how far she has to run in her high-heeled shoes. Sometimes she wants to back out because she doesn't think she can both train for Bamway and maintain a pleasant home atmosphere for her husband. It's the husband's job to convince her that there's no such word as can.
How did you do it, Dan?
Well, we worked out a system whereby Maureen would do all of the cooking and cleaning early in the morning, and after I'd finished my dinner that evening, we'd train. Many nights she'd save the dinner dishes until the next morning so it wouldn't cut into her evening workout.
Before we went on the air, you were telling me how you would prepare Maureen to run the whole quarter mile gradually.
Kip, I'd have Maureen run the distance in sandals at first, which is much easier than starting off in the regulation high heels. Then, once she got comfortable with what I call sandal distance, I'd have her trot in gradually growing heel heights until she could run effectively and easily in the regulation 3-inch heels. That way she could develop confidence.
How important is confidence to a good performance, Danny?
Kip, to the babes of Bamway, confidence is everything when it comes to running this marathon.
What those listening to this broadcast must remember is that at the Bamway Ladies Marathon, we're not dealing with athletes. We're dealing with the delicate-boned female of the species. And without natural athletic skills, confidence, as my partner Danny Prince pointed out, is everything. The competitors are heading to the starting line, and in a few minutes we will have the start of the 10th running of the Bamway Ladies Marathon here in Bamway, California. Dan, give us your expert evaluation of the front-runners of this race as I read their names to you.
Okay.
Well, first of all, we have Mr. and Mrs. Lionel Swampner of Elk Tidings, Kentucky. Lionel Swampner is a computer consultant for Chadcock Technological Industries in Elk Tidings, and his hobbies include hunting, fishing, sailing, golfing, and stamp collecting. And earlier this month, he was named Elk Tidings Man of the Year. Mrs. Swampner, the former Doris Whittlechap, enjoys house cleaning, child raising, and making her Lionel happy. Danny, what are the Swampner's chances?
Lionel Swampner is one heck of a competitor, Kip. If I know Lionel, and I know him pretty well, he's managed to transfer at least 37% of his winning attitude onto his better half. I give the Swampners a good to excellent chance to win this thing.
Well, Lionel Swampner is the one who paid the entry fees, but Doris is the one who has to run this marathon. How does she look?
She runs like a girl, naturally. But seriously, with her husband's help, I think she'll do very well.
Well, next we have the Caldings, James Calding and his lovely wife, Jane. Mr. Calding is a real estate executive in his hometown of Chomp City, Utah. In his spare time, he dabbles in architecture, agriculture, photography, carpentry, virology, and entomology. Jane Calding is active in the Chomp City PTA and happily prepares gourmet meals for her husband's surprise guests on a moment's notice. How about the Caldings?
Well, Kipper, Jimmy Calding told me that he and Jane have been experimenting with a new diet. Jane's been subsisting on steak and licorice for the past 3 weeks.
Why steak and licorice, Dan?
Candy and protein taken together for a prolonged period of time tends to create a restlessness within the body. Jimmy's banking on that restlessness, jarring Jane out of her natural feminine passiveness and making her into more of a competitor.
Well, what about their chances for victory, though?
I'd say their techniques are a little too experimental, so I'd say the odds are against them.
Okay. Well, the odds makers are also talking about Mr. and Mrs. Paul Bungwafer of Seaweescoo, Wisconsin. Paul Bungwafer sits on the Board of Indian Affairs for the state of Wisconsin. He has a master's degree in international relations, and in his spare time, Paul writes treaties between hostile nations and entertains visiting heads of state. And Wilson Bungwafer is a housewife. What about the Bungwafer's chances?
Paul Bungwafer tells me his wife had her nose bobbed for this event to cut down her wind resistance. I've seen her in training for the last 2 years, and I see a great deal of improvement this time out.
Okay, Danny. Well, the entrants are at the starting line, and in a few minutes we will have the trumpets marking the beginning of the 10th running of the Bamway Ladies Marathon. Dan, who do you pick to win this year?
I picked the Bungwafers to win it all the way.
This is Kip Murdoch with Danny Prince, and momentarily we will hear the trumpets telling the men to start their wives running. Well, folks, the race is underway. 61 married women running as hard as they can while still retaining an appropriate aura of femininity. Standing at the starting line, their 61 husbands exhort them to keep running no matter how much the pain. Danny, what do the husbands shout as their wives get further and further out of hearing range?
They shout things like, "That a girl," and "Go, go."
How much effect does that kind of encouragement have on the ladies?
I think it has a big effect until they round the first turn, when they get out of earshot. Then they're on their own.
The early leader is Mrs. Lionel Swampner of Elk Tidings, Kentucky. An unseeded runner, Mrs. Nathan Sinker of Varpletown, New Hampshire, is second, followed by Mrs. Paul Bungwafer. Mrs. Calding is alone in fourth place. Dan, Mrs. Swampner is following her usual pattern of leading from the opening trumpet.
Yes, she is. Her problem in the past has been tiring in the later stages of the race, but I talked with Lionel Swampner, and he says that she's in better condition this year than ever before.
Mrs. Nathan Sinker has just closed the gap and is now running neck and neck with Mrs. Swampner. What do you know about her husband, Danny?
Nathan Hookline Sinker manufactures wiffle balls and plastic bats in Varpleton, New Hampshire. This is his first Bamway. His wife Felicia has previously run the first quarter mile of the Boston Marathon, the New York Marathon, and the Market Street in San Francisco. And Mr. Sinker's hobbies include deep-sea fishing, lawn bowling, polo, and trap shooting.
What about Mrs. Sinker? What does she do when she's not running?
The bio ends here without saying. I imagine she stays at home and takes care of her 2 sons, Clemson and Botticelli.
The leaders of the 10th running of the Bamway Ladies Marathon are bunching up. Mrs. Paul Bungwafer is in sole possession of second place, 1 length behind Mrs. Swampner and Mrs. Sinker. Mrs. Calding is 2 lengths behind Mrs. Bungwafer, although it appears that she's falling back. The rest of the competitors are just that, ladies and gentlemen, competitors. They have no chance to finish first in this race.
And Mrs. Bungwafer appears to be running very easily now, Kip. I guess that nose job she had this year is helping her cut down on wind resistance.
Mrs. James Calding is falling back. She's slowing. She even appears to have tired, Danny.
She looks like she's in pain, Kip. She looks like she's doing her darndest to maintain her graceful feminine posture and not double up on us. What a trooper.
She's stopping. She's stopping. Mrs. James Calding is withdrawing from the competition.
That's too bad. I really feel for Jimmy Calding. He worked so hard getting his wife ready for this race, only to have her pull out before its conclusion.
Do you think it was that steak and licorice diet?
I'm pretty sure it was. It was just too experimental.
Mrs. Nathan Sinker has just passed Mrs. Lionel Swampner for the lead. She put on a burst of speed and not only passed her, but put a length between her. Mrs. Bungwafer is holding on to third place.
One thing I was just thinking about was how while Mrs. Bungwafer cut down on her wind resistance by having her nose bobbed, she also gave herself a disadvantage.
How's that, Dan?
Well, with her reduced proboscis, Mrs. Bungwafer's going to have a hard time nosing out anybody.
It's academic by now, with Mrs. Bungwafer 5 lengths behind second place Mrs. Swampner and the ladies rounding the final turn. Danny Prince is making his way down to the finish line so that he can interview the winners. Very quickly, I will give you the standings. Mrs. Nathan Sinker of Varpletown, New Hampshire is the surprise leader, followed by Mrs. Lionel Swampner and Mrs. Paul Bungwafer. It looks like a 57-weight tie for fourth. And another front runner, Mrs. James Calding, tired and had to pull out before the final turn. They're coming down the final stretch, and it's going to be Mrs. Nathan Sinker coming in first at the 10th Bamway Ladies Marathon. Mrs. Lionel Swampner finishes second, followed by Mrs. Paul Bungwafer in third place. Felicia Sinker, wife of Nathan Sinker of Varpletown, New Hampshire, has won the Bamway Ladies Marathon. Not only was she unranked, but it was her first Bamway. My colleague, Danny Prince, is at the finish line, and he's going to try to interview the winners. Danny, are you there?
Yes, I am, Chipper. I'm standing next to Nathan Sinker's charming wife, Felicia. Together, we're awaiting her husband's return from the winner's circle, where he's accepting the Bamway Cup, the plaque, the $20,000, and of course, the bouquet of long-stem roses for Mrs. Sinker. As soon as he gets here, we can conduct an interview.
Were you surprised that the Sinkers did so well their first time out?
Yes, I was, Kip. This is the first time that an unseeded runner has ever won at Bamway, and the last thing I thought would happen this year would be the setting of a precedent. As you remember, I picked the Bungwafers to walk away with this one. Still in all, I'm glad for the way this one turned out, because it's good to get some new blood into any sporting event.
How about Felicia Sinker? Was she surprised at how well she did?
I imagine she was. From my vantage point beside her, she looks fairly surprised by it all. As soon as Mr. Sinker gets here, we can find out for sure.
Unfortunately, Danny, we're all out of time.
That's too bad. I'm afraid we won't get a post-marathon interview after all. I would like to say, though, Kip, that it has been a pleasure working with you again.
The same goes to you, Danny. The same to you. And once again, we'd like to congratulate Mr. and Mrs. Sinker for their remarkable victory here at the 10th running of the Bamway Ladies Marathon. For Danny Prince, this is Kip Murdoch in Bamway, California, wishing you a good day and a pleasant life. Bye, everybody.